The night shift at 14. My name is Marcus Thorne. For 3 years, I worked as a structural preservationist at the Kennecott National Historic Landmark. My job was to maintain the physical integrity of the 14-story concentration mill. I am not a man prone to superstition. I have spent my life around heavy machinery and decaying timber. I understand how buildings settle under snow. But what happened during the winter of 2024 was not structural decay. I am recording this because the Park Service has listed my resignation as medical leave due to psychosis, and I refuse to let that stand as the only record of what resides in the upper levels of that mill. The 14-story mill is a vertical labyrinth of red-painted wood and massive machinery. In the winter, the tourists are gone, and the town of McCarthy shrinks to a few souls. The mill becomes a tomb. I was the only person authorized to be inside after dark. Our routine involved checking support cables and ensuring the snow load wasn't bowing the roof of the lower bins. On December 12th, the temperature hit -35 degrees. I was on the 10th level, checking the bearings on a massive copper crusher, when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was the sound of a heavy leather-bound boot striking a floorboard. It was slow and rhythmic. Step, drag, step, drag. It was coming from the 11th level directly above me. I thought it might be a squatter, though why anyone would climb 11 stories into a freezing mill in the middle of a subarctic night was beyond me. I stayed silent, my headlamp dimmed, listening. The drag portion of the step was heavy, like something sharp was being pulled. I called out, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped instantly, leaving a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. I climbed to the 11th level. I had a heavy mag light and a radio. When I swept the floor with my light, I found nothing but the massive silent shapes of the Wilthley tables. Then I saw the trail in the dust. It wasn't a footprint. It was a wide, jagged furrow, as if a heavy iron tool had been dragged through the silt. The trail began in the center of the room and led toward the north wall, where it simply stopped. There were no return tracks. No footprints led to the start of the furrow. It was as if the weight had materialized out of the air. I reported it to the manager. He laughed, suggesting it was a dust devil or a stray lynx. But I knew what I heard. That night, I returned to the mill. I felt a strange tether pulling at my chest. I spent the first few hours on the lower levels, but as midnight approached, I found myself climbing, bypassed the 11th level, heading for the 14th, the very top where the ore cars entered from the tramway. The air there was significantly colder, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the siding. It felt like standing inside a giant dying ribcage. I reached the 14th level at 12:15 a.m. The floor was covered in frost. I sat on a stack of timber and waited. For an hour, there was nothing. Then a smell hit me. It wasn't rot. It was the sharp, metallic temps of raw copper mixed with old, wet wool and something burnt like scorched hair. It was cloying. I stood to leave when the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath not as a mist, but as thick, swirling clouds that seemed to be sucked toward the center of the room by an unseen vacuum. Then came the voice. It was a low, vibrating hum that resonated inside my skull. It sounded like a man speaking through a mouthful of gravel. The grade was too low. The words were devoid of human emotion. I turned my light toward the sound. Standing by the tramway opening was a figure. It was a man in a heavy canvas coat, stiff with grease and ore dust. His face was a waxy mask, and his eyes were empty pits, bored out like drill holes. He held a heavy iron sampling bar, and the end of it was glowing with a dull, internal heat. This was not a vision. I could hear the man's wet, rattling breathing. I could see the floorboards groaning under his weight. He was a solid entity. He didn't look at me, focused on the emptier chutes. He lifted the iron bar and slammed it into the wooden siding. The sound was a physical shockwave that knocked me back. When the bar hit the wood, it turned black and charred instantly. The man turned his head toward me then, a slow, mechanical movement that made the vertebrae in his neck audibly crack like dry sticks. I scrambled for the stairs. I didn't look back until I reached the 12th level, stopped to catch my breath, my lungs burning. I looked up through the open machinery well. A figure was standing at the edge of the 14th level floor, looking down at me. He was leaning over the railing, his dirt-stained fingers gripping the wood so hard I heard it crush. He let out a long, agonizing groan that sounded like metal cables snapping under tension. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering. This was a man who had died in agony and was still dying. I made it out and didn't stop running until I reached my cabin. The next day, I researched accident reports. I found a 1928 ledger. A foreman named Thomas Grier had been killed during a midnight haul. Cable had snapped, and he had been pinned against the siding by a heavy iron sampling bar that had been heated in a forge. The report mentioned the bar seared through his chest. He lingered for 3 hours in the dark before the morning shift found him. The description of his coat and his tools matched the figure on the 14th level exactly. I tried to convince myself it was a residual haunting, a loop in time. But residual hauntings don't react to people. Thomas Grier had looked at me. 2 nights later, I returned to the mill, driven by a need to understand the physical nature of the entity. I brought a thermal imaging camera and a high-sensitivity microphone. I set up on the 11th level. At 1 a.m., the thermal camera glitched, a screen filled with static, and then a solid black shape appeared. It wasn't a cold spot, it was a null spot, a place where heat was being erased from reality. The microphone picked up the step drag sound from the 12th level. I listened through the headphones. Step, drag, step, drag. Interspersed was a faint metallic clinking. I realized it was the sound of coins. Grier had always carried his week's wages in his pocket, afraid of the company's script system. The clinking grew louder, and the sound began coming from all directions. It was in the walls, the ore chutes, the very timber. The mill was becoming an extension of his presence. It wasn't just in the building, he was the building. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. It was turned off, the battery removed, yet a voice came through. It was Grier, Marcus. The cables, they won't hold. Hearing my name sent a jolt of ice through me. I looked at the thermal camera. The black shape was 10 feet away. I looked with my naked eyes and there was nothing. But through the camera, Grier was standing right in front of my tripod, reaching toward the lens. The waxy skin of his face was peeling away in the heatless void, revealing the charred blackened bone beneath the surface. I backed away, but the exit door slammed shut. The iron bolt, which weighed 20 pounds, slid into place as if pushed by an invisible hand. I was trapped, the air filled with a fine, gray dust, or tailings that hadn't moved in 80 years. The dust began to swirl, forming a vortex. Inside, I saw the mill as it was in 1928. I saw the sparks, heard the roar of the crushers, and felt the heat of forges. It was a physical bleed-through of another era. Grier stood in the center, his iron bar glowing white-hot. He walked toward me. Each step cracked the modern floorboards. He wasn't a transparent ghost. He was a solid mass of displaced time. When he reached my equipment, he stepped on the thermal camera. I heard the plastic shatter and the glass grind into the wood. This was the terrifying reality, the ability to exert massive physical force. He raised the iron bar and I saw the red-hot tip inches from my face. I could feel the heat radiating from it, a searing, dry heat that singed my eyebrows and made my skin blister. "I can't get the weight right," he groaned. He swung the bar, and it passed through my shoulder. It didn't cut like a blade. It felt like a bar of solid ice driven through my muscle, followed by intense, agonizing burning. I fell to my knees, my breath hitching. I looked at my shoulder. There was no blood, but the fabric of my jacket was charred, and the skin underneath had turned a bruised, necrotic purple. He wasn't trying to kill me. He was trying to process me, to make me part of the machinery. I managed to crawl toward the ore chute. It was a steep, metal-lined slide that dropped 3 stories. It was a suicide jump, but staying was worse. I threw myself into the darkness. I tumbled down the metal chute, the edges of the steel slicing into my skin. I hit the bottom of the bin with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I lay there, surrounded by the smell of ancient copper and dry rot. Above me, I could hear the step drag of Grier on the metal lip of the chute. He was coming down. I fumbled for my mag light and flicked it on. The beam hit the wall of the bin, and I saw thousands of handprints. They were small, the size of children's hands, pressed into the dust. They were fresh. I realized then that Grier wasn't the only thing in the mill. The mill had employed breaker boys, children who cleared clogs in the machinery. Many had been crushed. I heard their whispers now, a frantic chatter. "Hide, hide, hide. The foreman is coming, hide." The sounds weren't in the air. They were in the wood. The whispers came from the walls. I saw the dust move as if small bodies were scurrying behind the timber. Then, a child appeared. He was 10 years old, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with a permanent, glassy stare. He reached out and grabbed my hand. His skin was as cold as dry ice. Didn't say anything, but he pulled me toward a small access hatch at the base of the bin. I followed him, dragging my injured shoulder through the tight space. Behind me, the heavy thud of Greyer landing in the bin echoed. I crawled through the subflooring, a space filled with rusted gears. The child led the way, his body flickering in and out of the light. He wasn't a guardian. He was a terrified soul doing what he had done in life, hiding from the foreman. We moved through the bowels of the building for what felt like hours. The sound of Greer's footsteps followed us, a relentless heavy pounding that vibrated through the foundation. Greer was tearing the building apart to get to us. I heard massive timbers being snapped and iron plates being ripped from rivets. The child stopped at a heavy iron grate leading to the drainage tunnels beneath the mill. He pointed down into the dark water. I looked back and saw a glow approaching. It was the red-hot tip of Greyer's sampling bar. The light reflected off the soot-stained face of the boy, and for a second, I saw his true form, a skeletal, a withered thing with its jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. He vanished, leaving me alone. I kicked the grate open and dropped into the icy water. The current was strong, pulling me toward the creek outside. I waded through the tunnel, my body numb. I looked back one last time. Greer was standing at the grate. He didn't follow me into the water. Couldn't. He was tied to the structure, tied to the floors where he had bled out. Stood there, his empty eye sockets fixed on me, the iron bar glowing a violent, angry crimson. He raised the bar in a mock salute, and then the tunnel collapsed. The weight of the mill brought tons of rock and timber down, sealing the grate. I was swept out into the night. I woke up in the clinic 2 days later. They told me I had been found wandering the airstrip, screaming about the grade. They found the injuries on my shoulder but attributed them to a fall. I tried to tell them about Greyer, but they checked the mill and found no structural damage. The 11th level was pristine. The Orban was empty. There were no handprints in the dust. My thermal camera was found near the stairs, completely intact and functioning. There was no footage of the entity on the card. It had been erased. This is the horror of a high plausibility encounter. The world resets itself. The entity doesn't leave physical footprints for the authorities. It leaves them on you. My shoulder has never healed. The purple bruise remains, a permanent mark in the shape of a man's thumb and forefinger. On cold nights, the skin there radiates a dull heat, and the smell of ozone and copper fills my room. I can hear the clicking of the coins in my sleep. I know that Thomas Greer didn't go away. He's simply waiting. I resigned the following week. I couldn't look at the mill anymore. I moved to Anchorage, but the silence of the city is different. In the mill, the silence was a physical weight. I've started to notice things here too. I'll be in a modern building, and for a split second, the smell of wet wool and burnt hair will waft through the vents. I'll hear a single, heavy footstep on the floor above me. The bleed-through wasn't limited to the mill. Once you have been processed by an entity, you become a permanent conductor. I recently contacted the woman who took over my position. I didn't warn her directly. I asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about the 14th level. She was silent for a long time on the phone. Then she whispered, "I found a furrow in the dust. It looks like something heavy was dragged toward the north wall." I hung up. There was nothing I could do. To acknowledge the entity is to give it more power. Thomas Greyer isn't a ghost. He is a biological and temporal echo that has achieved physical agency. I've spent months studying the physics of residual trauma manifestation. There are papers about how high-intensity deaths in mineral-rich environments can create a biological battery. The copper and limestone of the Kennecott Range act as a natural capacitor, storing the electrical energy of the human nervous system at the moment of death. Thomas Greyer didn't pass on because his energy was literally grounded into the mountain. He is as much a part of the Alaskan landscape now as the glacier or the peaks. He is a permanent, haunting reality of history. I am recording this for anyone who finds themselves in the high country mines. Do not go inside after dark. Doesn't matter how many lights you have. The dead in those places don't care about your technology. In fact, they use it. They use the batteries and the frequencies to manifest. If you smell ozone, if you feel a sudden pressure in your ears, or if you hear the sound of a heavy boot dragging across wood, do not investigate. Run. The entities in the mill are not looking for peace. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I am not crazy. I am a survivor of a physical haunting. I have the scars to prove it, even if the Park Service refuses to acknowledge them. The 14-story mill is a monument to tragedy, but it is also a vessel. It is a hollow shell filled with the trapped angry energy of men like Thomas Gruyere. It is a place where the barrier between was and is has worn thin. If you go there, listen for the coins. Listen for the drag of the bar. I can hear him now. I'm in a hotel room, and the temperature has just dropped. My breath is misting in the air, and it's being pulled toward the closet. I can smell the burnt hair and the raw copper. There is a heavy, metallic thud on the floor above me. Thomas Gruyere didn't stay in Kennecott. He followed the mark he left on my shoulder. He followed the frequency. I'm turning off the recorder. I have to find a way to ground myself. The grade is too low and the foreman is coming.